In a visit from a lovely being yesterday, it was evident that they were at an impasse, and it was related that during pursuing a course of study, it was necessary to write essays, and it was felt that it would be very beneficial if these essays were put out there. But the self-doubt was so great, statements were made, but I'm not a journalist, perhaps I should give these essays to someone else who's more qualified to put out there, and I don't know how to go about it. So it was rather forcefully said to her, you have to know who you are, and you have to know what you do. And that brings us back to the question that we might ask ourselves, and we have asked, why is it when our spiritual journey strips away any sense of self, identity, why is it that we need to know who we are and what we do? And it reminded of a long story that again poses a question for each of us, but also brings us to the point of possible recognition of what the answer to this question might be. And it's that story about Hamid. Now Hamid, from the very early age of about 7 years old, was recognized as being very intelligent, extraordinarily intelligent. But not only that, but he was a fine being. He was kind and thoughtful, gentle. But because this was known by people around, the villages in which he lived, because he was the son of a shepherd, they put money together for him to go to a great learning institution. But before he left to enter that school, his mother made a parcel of his shepherd's cloak and his straw sandals, and giving this parcel to her son Hamid, she said, "This is so you do not forget from whence you came." So very rapidly Hamid rose through the ranks, excelling at his studies. And it came a time for him to seek employment, but he was very readily taken up by the Sultan's court. And he, at that time, because of his qualities, very rapidly rose up in the ranks of the hierarchy of the court until he became a close advisor of the Sultan himself. But as is the way of these courts, even though Hamid was revered by many, there were also many who were very jealous of him, seeking the place in which he found himself now as a Grand Vizier of the Sultan. So there was a plot against Hamid, and they watched his every move, until finally one amongst them went to the Sultan to say to him, "We believe Hamid is going to a place every day to count the loot that he has stolen from your treasuries. We see him every day going into a locked room, no doubt, to count his ill-gotten gains. So the Sultan ordered, with great sadness, having just a faint doubt about Hamid's honesty and persona, that Hamid's room be invaded. And so it was. The door was broken down, and the contents of that room were brought back to the Sultan, but with some not knowing what it was that it meant. But when Hamid was brought before the Sultan and was asked, what is the meaning of this, displayed before him were his shepherd's cloak and his straw sandals. When the Sultan demanded to know what these meant, Hamid related that every day he went into this room to put on his shepherd's cloak and his straw sandals to remind himself of from whence he came. Now, when the Sultan heard this, tears came to his eyes, and he revered his advisor even more, to the extent that he now demanded that Hamid be with him every moment of every day, even when he went to his private chamber in the afternoons for rest. He insisted that Hamid sit there whilst the Sultan rested his head on Hamid's knee while he slept. But in the meantime, there was an occasion when the Sultan, in the company of Hamid, went out into his garden. But it was winter time, and the gardens were very much bare. But looking up, the Sultan saw that there was one flower growing out of the parapet on the side of his palace, and he wanted that flower. So he said to Hamid, Hamid, climb on my shoulders and take that flower. But there was insistence, and the reverse was happening. It was Hamid who stood on the shoulders of the Sultan to retrieve that flower. And the thought came to Hamid in that moment, look at me, the son of a shepherd, standing on the shoulders of the greatest Sultan of the age. Some time later, it was necessary to have a reception for a visiting ambassador, but the Sultan was having other duties to perform, so it was left to Hamid to hold this reception. It was whispered after that party that Hamid's reception was even greater than that of one that the Sultan would have himself. And so it happened that at a time after that, Hamid was standing in front of the mirror with his Grand Vizier's cloak and his hat encrusted with jewels to show his status. He stood tall and again had the thought, look at me, the son of a shepherd, the Grand Vizier of all the lands. Not long after, in the inner chamber of the Sultan, with guards outside the door, the Sultan lying with his head on Hamid's lap. Suddenly, before Hamid's eyes, there appeared a beautiful being, a young man with a glowing white cloak. Hamid was shocked. Who are you? How did you get in here when this chamber is guarded by soldiers? And the young being said to Hamid, I am your luck, and I'm here to tell you I'm going to sleep. But by this time, Hamid had taken out the jeweled dagger that the Grand Vizier always had at his waist and raised it up to attack this being, when suddenly the beautiful young man disappeared, and at that moment the Sultan woke up to find his beloved Grand Vizier with a dagger pointing at his heart. What could the Sultan think? Only that his beloved Grand Vizier had intention to assassinate him. So the guards were called, and Hamid was taken away to the dungeons to await the beheading that was the fate of anyone who threatened the Sultan's life. Now, because there were many in the court who revered Hamid, they begged the Sultan to spare his life. And so the Sultan did, but he decreed that Hamid should be sent out of his kingdom, to be sent into exile. So, stripped of all his Grand Vizier's robes, Hamid was sent far, far away. At first, Hamid was terribly lost. He wandered aimlessly about until there was a farmer who invited him in, and when it was found that the farmer had just lost his helper, Hamid was offered the job of grinding the wheat, helping with the heavy work around the farm. This Hamid did gratefully, every night falling on his simple pallet into a deep sleep from the great fatigue of the work that he was doing. And this went on for 7 long years. After that time, one night, Hamid was awoken in the middle of the night by a great effulgence, a great light in his room. It was the young man, his glowing white robes, and he said to Hamid, "I am your luck, and I've come to tell you I've woken up." At that same time, the Sultan had a dream, because in those 7 years, the palace, the kingdom, had fallen into disarray. He was threatened by armies outside his kingdom. His advisors were turning against him. And in the Sultan's dream, he was told that only Hamid could bring peace and again flourishing kingdom for him. So the next day after his dream, the Sultan sent out messengers to find Hamid. After some while, indeed they did, finding him in the simple farmhouse far away. He was brought back to the palace with great pomp and ceremony, and restored to his position as the closest advisor, the Grand Vizier of the Sultan of all the lands. So the question that arises from this story, relative to what was said to the lovely being yesterday, what for us does luck mean? What is this that in this story is called luck?
I think of humility.
Humility is the necessity for it to be present. But what is it? This?
Well, it seems like luck is opportunity in this and in that story,
Yes.
and everything seems to be in alignment with it and cooperate with it and make it happen. That seems to be what luck looks like.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, he knew who he was when he had the shawl and stuff.
Yes.
And then he forgot who he was and his luck went away.
Which answers our paradox. In our spiritual journey, we've been stripped away to nothing, so we don't have an identity that can claim, and I have this or I can do that. And yet it said we have to know who we are and what we do. So this is why this question is asked. What is it that's there when our ego is present and in control and trying to manipulate? And what is it that's there when there is no ego involved, no self to argue, no self to manipulate? What is it that's there that we must claim, as was said to this being yesterday? We must claim it.
It's like awareness, non-attachment, and awakening.
These are the qualities of it, but what is it? We can call it luck in this story, but if we change its name, we know what it is and we can claim it. What is it?
It's our true self.
Our true self, the power of life, isn't it? Wouldn't you say so? Recognizing it, claiming it. Not for ourselves to say, I can do this, I can do that. But acknowledging it. It's not separate, is it? Not outside. So what would you have made as a summation to this lovely being in this impasse and being told rather forcefully, you have to know who you are and what to do? Knowing that there had been arrival at a place where, for the most part, everything had been stripped away. Saying, I really know nothing, but I have these essays. What? How would you complete that?
You have to let the force come through you, and for that you need sort of humility and be totally open.
Absolutely. That we know, isn't it? That we know.
Just trust it.
Absolutely.
I heard a little story yesterday. A young journalist was being interviewed, and he said he had the honour of interviewing the Dalai Lama. And he said he was sort of overawed with it, but he had this question about what we can do, but it sort of came out, sort of, what can I do, you know, like, but he meant it for everybody, you know, like what can I as an individual do,
Yes.
meaning us
Yes.
collectively. And the Dalai Lama looked at him very closely and he said, you've got to write your story. You've got to write this lady here's story, and you've got to write my story.
Right.
Because when you do that, in fulfilling that, we all come to know each other and ourselves. And I just, you know, you telling that story just reminded me of that.
Yes.
Because, yeah, he's gone on to write books and things, but he just...
Richard Feiglin.
Richard Feiglin was
That's
in
his
New
name.
York.
That's his name.
Anyway, yeah, he came from very humble beginnings too, and but that's what he does.
Yes.
He's the writer.
Yes.
That's what he does.
Yes.
And that he needed to express that, and the Dalai Lama picked up on.
It's really the Dalai Lama's story, because
Yeah.
the Dalai Lama himself came from shepherd
Yes.
stuff.
Yeah.
didn't he?
Yeah.
Thank you.